Well, it's time now for Perspective, described by one critic as the most terrifying book they'd ever read. The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, chronicles the ever-increasing rate at which our planet is heating up and what that means for humans and the natural world we rely on. Does its author, David Wallace-Wells, have any hope at all that we can avoid an all-out climate catastrophe? Well, he joins me now on set. Thank you very much indeed for coming on to speak to us here at France 24. Now, your book does have an extremely alarming title. The revelations it contains are even more alarming. Just how bad have things got?
Well, right now, the planet is about 1.1 degrees warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution, which doesn't sound like much, but it already makes it hotter than it's ever been in all of human history. So everything that we've ever known as a species is a result of climate conditions we've already left behind. And almost certainly, I think, we're going to get about twice as much warming as we have today, which would mean major cities in South Asia and the Middle East would become so hot that you wouldn't be able to walk around outside without risking heat stroke or death. It would mean damages from storms and sea level rise could grow 100-fold, and the UN estimates that we could have hundreds of millions of climate refugees, again, just by 2050 at about 2 degrees of warming. We're on track for almost twice as much warming as even that by the end of the century, but how much we get past 2 degrees is really up to what we do now, what kind of action we take, because even as horrifying as some of these impacts can sound, ultimately they're a reflection of human power over the climate. And we are the ones driving this story. We can drive it in a somewhat different direction if we take action today.
Now, you mentioned climate refugees just then. Who are the people who are going to be most affected by the changing climate?
Well, it will affect all of us. It's a universal story. No one on planet Earth, I think, will be unaffected. No life will be unaffected. But it is the people in the global south who will be hit hardest. In fact, they're already being hit that hard. There have been studies showing that major cities in the developing world, major countries in the developing world have lost as much as 25% of their GDP over the last few decades already because of climate change. Droughts, famines, intense extreme weather, these are already hitting parts of the equatorial band of the planet, and that will only intensify going forward. Probably the two countries that will be hit most hard are India and Bangladesh. India is scheduled to receive about a quarter of all global climate impacts this century, and Bangladesh could be 2/3 underwater in the second half of this century. So the impacts are most intense there, but nowhere will be untouched. We're seeing already this summer extreme heat in temperate parts of Europe, records being set in June, then broken in July, and then approached again in August. These are records, heat records that used to last decades, if not centuries, and now they're being broken 3 times in a single summer. And that's just today, as we're only beginning to live in this new world.
Now, in your book, you make an argument for the direct link between the climate emergency and political and social instability. How exactly do you explain that link?
Well, there are a lot of pressures that climate change puts on any society, starting with, say, the direct heat effects. If people are dying of heat stroke at large scale, that is a social pressure, but also there are agricultural problems. If we get to 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, where we will be if we don't change course, agricultural yields could be only half as bountiful as they are today. We'd be using them globally to be feeding about 50% more people. And if there are widespread famines because of what's called multiple breadbasket failures, which is where many different regions of the world that produce food are having droughts, then we could end up with large-scale famine. There's also public health issues. You know, the mosquitoes that used to only fly in the tropics carrying malaria and dengue could be flying as far north as the Arctic Circle. There could be diseases we don't yet really even know about, which could be transmitted or brought around to new parts of the world by the force of climate change, in addition to the economic impacts, which economists say at 4 degrees of warming, where we'd be at 2100 if we don't change course, we could have a global GDP that's at least 20% and maybe 30% smaller than it would be without climate change, which is an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. There are impacts almost everywhere you look. Just about every aspect of modern life would be affected if we don't take dramatic action quite quickly, and each of them would destabilize the societies in which all of us today live.
And if we carry on as we currently are, what sort of timescale are we looking at for these catastrophic consequences of global warming?
Well, it's not a binary system, so it's not about passing a threshold at which point we go from a comfortable climate to an apocalyptic one. Every little tick upward of temperature that we create will create more suffering. But at the end of the century, we're talking about globally $600 trillion in climate damages, which is twice as much wealth as exists in the world today. It could mean parts of the planet could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. But the impacts are really already with us today. Houston was hit by a storm last week, a major storm. It was called the fifth 500-year storm in 500 years. Now, that term is sort of meaningless in an age of climate change, but originally it meant a storm that hit once every 5 centuries. That means once since Hernando Cortés landed in Mexico, since Europeans started settling North America, one storm in all that time, and Houston's been hit by 5 in the last 5 years. So we're already living in unprecedented times, unprecedented climate, in a way that our parents and grandparents would have recognized even the world today as almost impossible to live in. 9 million people are already dying every year from air pollution, which is not exactly a result of climate change, but is produced by the same thing that produces climate change, which is to say the burning of fossil fuels. We've normalized that amount of suffering already, which is a kind of indictment of us in the wealthy West, but it's going to get considerably worse very quickly if we don't find ourselves motivated to take dramatic action to limit the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere and therefore limit the amount of warming we experience.
And how do you account for those levels of ambivalence, not just among general populations, but among national leaders, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil?
Well, I think the public opinion is moving quite rapidly, thanks in part to the climate protests we've seen over the last year, and I think also because of a new honesty from the scientific community about just how bad things are. Also because extreme weather is now for the first time really showing up in the present tense. It's no longer a story of the future. But there is a problem of indifference. People, even who express concern about the climate, aren't all that interested in doing that much to address it. And it's especially the case at the level of our politics, which I think to some degree reflects an now outdated economic conventional wisdom that it would be too expensive to take action. Today, now most economists believe faster action would be better for us. But it also is a result of the fact that there is a kind of perversity of incentive facing every national leader. You know, the citizens of France will be living in essentially the same climate, whatever their government does, if the rest of the world doesn't take action. The same is true for almost every country in the world, which means each individual leader is only truly incentivized to take action if the whole global community is moving simultaneously. And people like Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, who adopt a much more narrow nationalistic view of self-interest, see their own role as securing advantage for their own citizens in a warming world, which is a trend I worry will continue going forward as a sense of growing resource scarcity and zero-sum competition grows around the planet.
I think it's fair to say this is a very alarming book. It's a scary read. Are you at all optimistic for the future?
I think optimism is a matter of perspective. If you are hoping to preserve the climate as it exists today, there's no hope. But if you take as a baseline of expectation the path that we're on, which will take us to 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, I think we can and will and are doing quite a lot to avoid those catastrophic levels. And it's important to keep in mind that that will always be the case. It's not a matter of avoiding 2 degrees, which I think is practically speaking impossible. It's a matter of doing as much as we can, as quickly as we can, wherever we can. I think the politics of the last year have changed enough that we can see that starting to happen, but unfortunately it's not yet happening fast enough.
A very, very cautious optimism from you today. David Wallace-Wells, author of The Uninhabitable Earth, thank you very much indeed for coming on to speak to us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.